Right. Good afternoon. My name is Louis Extian. I'm playing host today for the Executive Development Program Information Session webinar. Professor Herman Singh will join us in just a moment, and he will take us through the session today. Just one or two things as we start, and that is that we are recording today's webinar, and you will be able to find that recording a little bit later, so a few days after our webinar today, on the UJ University of Johannesburg YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Herman Singh, who conducts the virtual executive development program on behalf of Johannesburg Business School. Good afternoon, Herman.
Hi, Louis. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Okay, Herman, I think our attendees are here. They're still joining us. A couple of attendees will probably be a little bit late. But if you're a little bit late, or if you have to leave a little bit earlier, do not worry about it at all, because we are recording the session today, and you will be able to find it on the University of Johannesburg YouTube channel, and we'll let you know via email when that is available. Herman, I think we can start.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen quickly. Here we go. Louis, can you just confirm that you can see my screen, please?
Yes, I can. Perfect.
Great stuff. Thank you. Great, folks. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Professor Herman Singh, as you've heard, and I'll be sharing with you a bit of a webinar on really the way in which companies that are thriving in this pandemic, this crisis, if you will, the way in which they have been innovating. So it's really talking about thriving in chaos after this great reset. So I'll talk a little bit about the great reset. I'll talk a little bit about companies that have dived, companies that have survived, but companies that have thrived. And we'll talk about some of the solutions that they've used and how. And I'm going to use a few case studies, one in particular, to explain what some of these tools are. So the narrative for today, and today is meant to be an interactive session. So if you have questions, we've got a Q&A box, we've got a chat box. So please drop your comments into either the chat box or the Q&A box. I'll be checking both of them as we go. I'll be asking you some questions as well. So please feel free to lean forward rather than just lean back, and you can type your comments in as we go. So I'll be talking, as we said, about the EDP itself, the Executive Development Program. What is it? Why did we come up with it? And then I'm then going to share with you why we came up with this program. I'll talk about the Great Reset arising from COVID. And then we'll talk about a few examples of the thrivers. And then I'll do a case study, as I've said, diving into Zoom and some of the key lessons and tools. And of course, what we'll be doing is we'll be talking about those tools as we go through the EDP. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is included in my book, Divolution. It's available on Audible, Amazon, and you can also order it directly from us. So please send in an email if you'd like to order this book, but a lot of the content's in the book as well. There is also a 5 Secrets ebook that is available free of charge. You're also able to go to the website that you use to register for this program and download the ebook. And some of what I'm going to talk about today is included in that ebook. And it really talks about the 5 key tools that successful companies in this crisis have used. The EDP, as you've heard Louis talk about, is the Virtual Executive Development Program. It's a totally online program, and it runs for about 2.5 to 3 hours a day on these dates in February and until the 1st of March. And you pay once, and you can bring in your team members to sit with you and view it together with you if you have a team that you are managing. So all of you can be exposed to this material as you begin to implement it in your company. The EDP was designed really to be immediate, practical, using proven tools, very powerful tools. And as I've said, it's 7 sessions of 3 hours, and it moves away from theory. It helps you to become independent of consultants, and it takes a lot of this consulting speak and makes it very simple and easy to apply. Now, let's talk about this Great Reset. The Great Reset is an event that happened really in 2020. And the reset's a function of a number of things. It's a function of COVID, obviously, but it's also a function of the digital disruption that's been occurring for a while, as well as fundamental shifts and changes in macroeconomics on a global basis. So in other words, the sands of the world were shifting, and it's important to understand how they are shifting. Thank you to Louis for dropping the link for the EDP into the chat box. So folks, if you're interested in getting more information, please get that link. It's in the chat box now. Now let's talk about this great reset. In this reset, you've seen there's a lot of blood in the water, but what people don't realize, I guess, is many companies have done well. And it's instructive to understand why. Andy Grove, who was a co-founder of Intel, wrote a book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And he said in his book, he says, bad companies are destroyed by crises, good companies survive them, and great companies are improved by them. And I'd like to talk about companies that are dramatically improved from this crisis and what they did. So firstly, some hard data. And this is a study from Harvard Business Review. They conducted very extensive tests in the past few recessions leading up to 2008. And they analyzed 4,700 companies, and the results were quite sobering. Firstly, they discovered that 17% of companies didn't survive a recession. Now, I think the figures for this recession are going to be far, far worse. It could be as much as 30 to 35% of companies don't survive the COVID recession. 80% of companies hadn't regained their pre-recession growth 3 years after the recession, and 40% of them hadn't even returned to the same revenue and profit level, and only 9% flourished. So in other words, 9% of companies outperform competitors by at least 10%. Now, it's really important to understand what these companies did and why and how. And in particular, COVID now is happening 10 years after this research was done, and how much of what those companies did can be translated into what's happening now. Now, COVID was quite different to the credit crunch we had in 2008 and that crisis. It hit companies differently across industries. There were companies that had low exposure, companies that had moderate exposure, and companies that had high exposure. Clearly, high exposure companies were companies that were very exposed to discretionary expenses, luxury brands, for example, and travel, and business travel in particular, but also tourism. We saw a huge hit occur in apparel. Car sales declined. Some moderate exposure in the services businesses, steel, hardware manufacturing, and chemicals. And of course, there was low exposure in things like certain construction industries, packaging. Pharmaceuticals, in fact, took a big jump up, and so did telecommunications. Now, how did this happen, and why does the picture look like this? Why does a COVID heat map look like this? Firstly, some companies were just lucky, right? I mean, if you were in home fitness, grocery delivery, takeaway food, online education, online games, board games, or remote working, well, you basically landed with your bum in the butter. It was serendipitous for you, and you won without doing anything. But there are a few factors that drove the dynamics. The first issue is your service location centric? Do I have to physically be in front of you? Do we have to be in the same place? You know, a plumber has to come to my house to work on my house. He can't give me the service over the internet. My barber has to, and I physically have to be in the same location. Does it have to be synchronous? In other words, do you perform the service while I'm there, or can it be asynchronous? Can you do it offline? So in other words, can I email you something which is remote, and then can you work on it while I'm not there? So you have synchronous and asynchronous, and you have location specific and non-location specific. Also, there was a huge issue on things like value prioritization. So in other words, people began to value certain products and services far more than they did others. And of course, there were a number of macroeconomic factors, and there are others, and I'll talk more about that. So if you look at value polarization, for example, what that means is, if you look at the growth of certain products like gloves and bread machines and cough meds and soups, etc., sales jumped. And then you look at things like briefcases and luggage and shoes, athletic shoes and men's formal wear. You can see sales of these things like gym bags and golf clubs and drones. All of these things fell. So there was a shift brought on by, firstly, value polarization. In other words, we've started to value things differently. And this talks to something called the utility function. And so people around the world, consumers around the world, have changed their utility curves. Now, that doesn't happen very often. If you analyze most marketing research, utility curves don't change very often. But this is a very clear shift in what people value and what people are prepared to pay for. Another thing that's, as I've said, is a service location dependent or is it location independent? Is it a synchronous service or is it an asynchronous service? So for example, something that survived were self-service stations, independent domestic nature tourism. They survived. They were asynchronous and they were location dependent. Some things dived. These things were synchronous and location dependent. You can see there in red. Anything with these two attributes really struggled. So tourism, traditional education, dining in restaurants, we've all seen this. What thrived? Well, things that were location independent and asynchronous, things we could do on our own time offline. So correspondence schools, virtual reality tourism, streaming services, online retail, etc. But this is a very nice model to use. And I'll be talking about giving you more examples of dive, survive, and thrive. Now, I'm just curious if you wouldn't mind, and if you'd like to maybe think about this, and if you feel like it, please type a comment into the chat box. I'll have a look. What do you think is important to thrive in this new age of competition after the Great Reset? What do you think we should be thinking about? So here's a chance for you to lean forward, get your hands on the keyboard, and drop a few thoughts into the chat box. Do you think it's about technology? Is it about multiple channels? Is it about self-service? Do we need to be more customer-centric? Do we need to build more value propositions? Do we need to think about lower costs and new operating models? Is it about innovation? Is it about maybe the reversal from globalization back to localization? Are we going to de-globalize the world? Is it about maybe building more asset-light solutions? Because people don't want to own anything anymore. So if there's any thoughts, drop them into the chat box. I'm happy to have a look at it. Ahmed's comment was it's about new operating models. So we maybe need to get to look at new operating models. Any other thoughts, drop them in there. Grant's comment was that maybe we should think about more outsourcing. Thank you, Grant. That I think really very interesting. Both comments absolutely valid. And please keep thinking about that question, right? Because I'll be giving you some answers as we go through this. So yes, more outsourcing, new operating models. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some examples. Let me show you examples of companies that dived. These are companies that just struggled. And here's a listing of the largest bankruptcies in 2020, just a listing of some of the numbers. Here's an analysis of 140 big companies that have gone bankrupt. And you can see the industries that they are in: personal care, some of them are in media, entertainment. So cinemas, a lot of cinemas have gone bust around the world. In fact, Netflix is now taking movies, and so is a lot of Hollywood is taking movies straight to streaming. They're bypassing the cinema chain completely. Huge change. You'd never have expected that ever to happen. Energy companies going bust, especially because of the drop in the price of oil. Restaurants, retail, industrial materials, equipment, etc. So no surprises there. These are some of the brands that have imploded, from airlines to cruise liners to to brands like JC Crew, to car rental businesses. These have all gone bankrupt. We've seen a massive implosion in retail, and this is just an example to show you when these companies went bust. This is just last year, and it shows you, starting in January, the number of big brands that were basically imploding, including JCPenney went bankrupt in May. Aldo, it's a very big brand, went bankrupt in May as well. Brooks Brothers, quite famous, went bankrupt in July. And I mean, that I've cut the slide, so the slide is being cropped. There's a lot more companies that have gone bankrupt. JC Crew, as I said, went bankrupt in March. Industries have been imploded and disappeared completely. I don't think you're going to see the cruise ship industry come back. Planes are being cut up. Boats are being cut up. Ships are being cut up. These are not coming back. So it's not like, well, we'll get back to this when the pandemic is resolved, when we get a vaccine. When the vaccine arrives and everybody's been vaccinated and there's no risk of getting infected again, these ships won't be around anymore. They're gone, and no one's going to be building new ships. So these industries have gone. There's huge capacity leaving the industry. Now, some companies were able to pivot, and it's really instructive to look at what these companies have done. I'm going to look at Uber, some airlines, and Zumba, looking at how they pivoted. Here's what happened to the airline industry. We saw a 66% decline in flights compared to 2019 last year. And now I'm looking at the figures this year. We are still sitting, in fact, the figures have dropped even further now in the States. It recovered, it dropped initially to 10% off the previous year. We had 2.2 million people going through security at American airports. That dropped to 200,000 people. So it dropped from 2.2 million to 220,000. It's now back up to about 1 million people a day flying. So what did these airlines do? Well, Ethiopian Airlines shifted immediately into moving PPE, moving cargo. In fact, many planes have been repurposed. So some passenger planes have now had seats removed, and they're now carrying cargo instead. And obviously, these planes are going to be used to move vaccines. Some airlines have been very creative. They've in Taiwan they launched flights to nowhere. So sightseeing, plane takes off, flies around Taiwan for an hour, lands. Um, in Singapore, they turned the Airbus A380s into restaurants. You could board the plane, it wouldn't fly, wouldn't take off, it just sits there, and you can watch a movie. So you land, they'll serve you your normal airline food. You watch a movie. Australia, Qantas took the airline food and delivered it to your house. And Australia even started selling products that they would normally distribute on the plane. They're selling it to individuals who were nostalgic. Zumba, as an example, they run these training classes, and there was a huge issue. This is a Colombian company. They obviously, with lockdown, saw a big hit on their revenue. And in response, they quickly set up an online platform within 5 weeks, and they allowed all their trainers to take their classes online. And the company has since done very, very well. So Zumba classes continued, but online. So this is another example of how companies have pivoted. If you look at Uber, Uber's seen a massive collapse. And what Uber had to do was effectively, they went from a company that moved people to food and turned into a company that moved food to people. So they basically turned into a cargo company. So if you look at Uber in Q2 2019, Uber made 75% of revenue from ride hailing and 25% of revenue from delivery and freight. By Q2 2020, revenues were down 30% year on year, but ride hailing was down 70%, and ride hailing was only 41%. From 75% of revenue, it had dropped to 41% of revenue. What was important was that delivery and freight had grown to now 59%. So Uber is now a last mile delivery company. And this was important. I spoke to the vice president of Uber for Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And he walked me through how they did this. It was very traumatic. 8,000 people lost their jobs. Many drivers, this is in the company itself, and many hundreds of thousands of drivers around the world lost their jobs as well. But many jobs were protected because of this shift by Uber into a new kind of business. And they made other changes as well, which we will talk about on the EDP program. Now I want to talk about the company that's really fascinating. And I've got a few slides. I want to talk about a company called Zoom. We all know Zoom. And I want to share with you what Zoom did to become a company that is now worth over $100 billion. How did they do this? What did they do? So Zoom, you could argue, were lucky, right? Because really they were in the right place at the right time with the right product. We saw a move, you can see the move between 2018 to 2020 post-COVID of people working from home. So there was a huge increase in the number of home agents and people working from home, massive increase, and Zoom was in the right place to enable that. In the same way, if you look at what happened, the minute there was a confirmed case in a company which maybe looked like this, where employees were basically working as usual, the minute there was a confirmed case, the company shifted and you only had 7% of people working as usual versus 36. So huge shifts in the number of people working from home, where maybe it's 1 in 7 going up to 1 in 3. And these are global figures. If you look at schools did exactly the same thing. You'll see the impact on schools. We eventually had 1.4 billion students studying because there were 4.5 billion people under lockdown. So effectively, the future just arrived earlier than expected, right? Because we expected by 2028 that 73% of all teams would have remote workers. Well, actually, that happened a lot quicker than we expected, roughly 8 or 9 years earlier than we expected. So what happened? Well, Zoom suddenly, by April, had become the web conferencing tool of choice. 50% of businesses, in fact, were using Zoom. This is amazing because Zoom wasn't even a major player in this industry. It suddenly rocketed ahead, and video and the software that people were looking for. If you look at business software, it also was the preeminent supplier of video conferencing services. Now, this is the drop in the number of people flying, and this is the increase in the number of people using the service. So by around September, October last year, Zoom was already worth $50 billion. and it was worth more than 7 or 8 of the top airlines combined. And so what had happened is Zoom had very similar to Uber. Instead of moving people to food, Uber moved food to people. Well, instead of moving people to the work, they moved the work to the people. And that's what made Zoom so powerful, the Zoom boom, right? However, and you can see this adoption. There was an adoption in all web conferencing products, but look at this adoption in Zoom. So Zoom massively over-indexed. And so by April, the company was already worth $140 a share. I believe the current valuation of this company is in the order of 70 to 80. I beg your pardon, it's already over $100 billion. So this company has really rocketed ahead. Now, what did firms want from these platforms generally? They just wanted web conferencing software and a way to collaborate. They wanted remote desktop tools. And they wanted an easy way to start the meeting. They wanted lower costs. They wanted an easy to use solution for every user with high quality video calls. And they wanted to standardize the company's video conferencing software. So it's really important that you understand that 45% of companies chose their video conferencing solutions based on ease of use. And Zoom was one of the easiest products to use, but there were growing pains. So they went from 10 million to 200, 300. The current figure is close to 500 million people are now using Zoom globally. But they had growth pains. The first problem is the system couldn't handle this volume increase. The second problem was there was a security issue. The third problem was there weren't enough features that people needed. And finally, there was a challenge with some of the use cases. Teaching, for example, was a problem. They didn't have a perfect model for teaching, and it wasn't multilingual. They didn't have enough languages. Of course, the other problem was Zoom was free. And so how could you make money, and why is this company worth so much for a company that basically didn't charge people for anything? So the Zoom case study is really interesting, because what then happened is this company went into crisis mode, because the next problem was people began to crash Zoom sessions. You'll all remember the presentation by the president of South Africa where he used Zoom, and people, I don't think it was the president, it was one of the ministers, and people had hacked in to the Zoom session. So this was a real problem, because here was a company that's got stability issues, feature shortfalls. It didn't have a business model that worked, and it didn't have multilingual. It didn't have all the full feature set. It didn't have all the use cases, and suddenly it had a security issue as well. So what they did is this was called Zoom bombing. So we had the Zoom boom, and then we had the Zoom bomb. And so this company did something amazing. What they did was they paused all new feature development. And they basically said, during the COVID crisis and given the COVID surge, we're going to do a few things. Firstly, we're going to limit the number of features. We're going to limit the number of users. We're going to limit the number of, and we're going to focus all of our effort on fixing the business and getting the right features built. What they then did is the CEO, Eric Yuan, then said, for the next 90 days, we're committed to dedicating the resources needed to better identify, address, and fix issues proactively. We also committed to being transparent throughout this process. We want to do what it takes to maintain your trust. He then started on a series of things, which number one, stabilize the platform. Number two, fix the security defects. And number three, he then focused on schooling. He said, we want to own this schooling market. So he took schools as a key use case. And if you go back, I'm just going to run through what he did in March alone. They took the schools service, and in March 6th, they simplified the way in which a school could sign up by making it easy to sign up for a Zoom account, picking the best account option, and understanding the best practice for using Zoom in education. So they basically built an entire portal to help you use Zoom better to teach with. They increased support to basically all of the platforms, and they integrated into free remote teacher training webinars to actually teach teachers how to teach online. They offered online distance learning training. They offered help to schools. And then what they did is they removed the 40-minute limit for schools in Japan and Italy, as well as the K-12 schools in the US. They started providing multi-language resources for principals and vice principals, and they expanded live training of teachers. What they then did is they added live Zoom training sessions. They added recorded Zoom training sessions. Several of them were in German, Japanese, and Korean. They provided tips for instructors, as well as a Twitter thread. Then on March 12, 6 days later, they immediately expanded to a number of new countries, and they said you can now request that the 40-minute time limit be lifted for free basic Zoom accounts. What they then did the very next day, they unilaterally lifted the 40-minute meeting limit on free basic accounts for 60,000 K-12 schools in the United States. By March 16th, they then lifted the limit in the UAE, and by March 13th, they lifted the limit in Belgium, Czech Republic, etc. By March 13th, they'd lifted it in Canada, Germany. By March 20th, they then integrated into Khan Academy things like museums, for example, so that you could take students on a tour of a museum through Zoom. And by March 23rd, March 25th, they'd integrated Logitech so that you could then get free equipment bundles. So if you're a teacher, you could get Logitech would give you things like a mouse, etc. And there was an application form. They then lifted the limit in Hong Kong, and they lifted the limit in Israel. At the same time, by March 29th, they lifted it in Australia, India, and New Zealand. They then implemented a waiting room feature, and they then began the process of introducing multilingual services. Then what happened is towards the end of the year, they then lifted the limit for Christmas and New Year, so you had unlimited video calls. Now, this is an amazing thing, right? I've shown you what this company did within a period of a month. Where they're going with this is an amazing story. Because this company is now going one way. It's clearly a very successful firm. The first thing that they've decided is they've said they want to now expand into new markets with new products and new features. So they're now expanding into email, messaging, and calendar services. This is amazing, right? Because effectively they're starting to compete with Google, with Star Office, with Microsoft. And effectively what they want to do is, if you read the last sentence, we aspire to provide the most innovative, secure, reliable, and high-quality communications platform to help people connect, collaborate, build, and learn on Zoom. Well, that's amazing, because revenue is now flying. They changed their business model, and they've dramatically improved the number of features to the point where Zoom is now able to effectively, within a year, go from zero to taking on Microsoft. Well, that's astonishing, because they did it on a product that Microsoft should be winning on. Here's an example of what Microsoft has built, right? Because in a sense, software has appified our life and has eaten our offices. And it's mainly because of Microsoft and apps. So if you look at this, these are Office 365 apps, right? What do people do in an office and working remotely? We communicate, we collaborate, we work with content, we work on business processes, and we work with people. Well, everything you want to do is actually, it's got an app designed for it by Microsoft, and it's been put into Office 365. So effectively, this company is now challenging Microsoft's core product. At the same time, you can see here that a number of other third-party products that have also helped us with things like managing staff, managing daily work, managing work teams, dealing with company resources, dealing with events. Well, Zoom's going after all of this. So not only is Zoom taking on the Microsoft ecosystem, they're taking on the more global Office-based ecosystem. So this is a fascinating journey, and I'd love to hear what some of your thoughts are. I mean, what do you take from this? What do you think are the key learnings here? Because this is an amazing story, right? So please feel free to drop your comments into the chat box. What are the key insights, right? Because Ahmed asks the question, what are the elements needed for a successful pivot? Ahmed, I will answer that question shortly. But if there's any other thoughts around how to on what insights you draw, because I'm going to show you what tools exist and what these companies did and what companies like Zoom have done to be able to implement what you've just seen. So please feel free to drop comments and questions into the session. And Ahmed, I will deal with your question as I go through the next session. So here's some of the key observations of what Zoom did. Firstly, of the Zoom experience. Clearly, the digital customer has evolved. Right? It's almost a new kind of person. We've got different expectations. If things crash today, we're highly intolerant of that. Secondly, the digital economy has become much more complex. Thirdly, it's a winner-take-all market. You can see the way in which Zoom just ate the market share. It's very much about platforms and communities. It's also about being very customer-centric, which is driving competitive outcomes. And there's a huge focus on ruthless delivery of value. And so you've got to understand what this customer's new definition of value is. I explained to you in my opening comments the way in which consumers have changed the definition of value, the way in which the expectations have changed. And so what you need to do is respond to what is a tectonic shift in business strategies and business models. So that's really the reason why we came up with the EDP, because the EDP is designed to help you achieve exactly that. And the key elements of the EDP are basically showing you how Zoom and other companies like Zoom did what they did. What did they do? The first thing that they did, and we see this in all of the examples that I will share with you around companies that have thrived in this, is number one, many of them have done what I call a blue ocean shift. There's a book called Blue Ocean, the second book called Blue Ocean Shift. And we will walk through what this blue ocean shift is and what it means, and how do you move into what is known as an uncontested space, which is really what Zoom did. They went into a space that didn't exist. Nobody had gone out and built a global platform for schools to teach remotely. Nobody had done that. And so Zoom saw the opportunity and dived straight into it and built it out very, very quickly. A totally bespoke system for teaching in schools. The second thing that's key with all these companies is this immense focus on customer centricity. You can see the way in which Mr. Yuan actually said, customers first, let's figure out what the next best feature should be. And let's figure out what's important to customers and let's prioritize that. The third issue was this huge focus on building out digital platforms and allowing people to collaborate and making these businesses grow exponentially using what's called Metcalfe's law. I'll talk about that now. All of them demonstrated an amazing ability to be lean and agile. Many of these businesses have used what I call data monetization strategies. They've implemented what's called cost ovation and servitization. And so the executive development program that we'll be running will dive into these kind of 6 or 7 key tools that have really made a big difference for all the companies that I've been speaking about. So what I'd like to do now is just share with you a few examples of what this means in practice and how they're used. Now, obviously, on the program itself, we will have 27 hours. We'll have 27 hours to go into this in more detail. I can see a question popping up, so please feel free to pop more questions. I'll be presenting for about 15, 20 minutes more, and then I'll deal with your questions. So I'm going to go through each of these in turn to show you how these companies have used these tools. Let's look at Blue Ocean. So Blue Ocean is really about moving from a world of innovation to a world of disruption. Because innovation is really about doing the same things a little bit better. It's about continuous improvement, incremental, small changes. We move through a process of doing new things, and we end up with a process where we make the old things obsolete. And that's a very good example you are seeing here in Zoom in particular. They actually made their old business model redundant and built a brand new one. And in fact, they're making the Microsoft model obsolete. So how does one do that? Well, there's some great analogies I'll be using from Chan Kim's book, The Blue Ocean Strategy and the Blue Ocean Shift, looking at various tools, one of which is the 6 parts framework. We'll be looking at how businesses are able to, instead of focusing on rivals within an industry, you look across industry. So in other words, don't define your industry by the product that you sell, define yourself by a use case, by a customer segment, by a need. And that fundamentally means that you are no longer looking at a particular industry. A good example would be what ShopRite did to banks, for example. You know, banks said, we are banks and retailers are retailers. ShopRite checkers just went out and said, well, we're going to introduce money transfer. You know, you can walk into a ShopRite and send money to another ShopRite. We're going to introduce bill payment. We're going to allow for ticket pickups. We're going to allow for selling bus tickets, plane tickets. We're going to allow for selling financial services products like funeral cover and life insurance. Eventually, they said, well, why don't we just launch a bank account? And Pick n Pay is doing the same thing. So retailers have said, actually, we've got a whole group of customers. Why can't we sell them more things? And so you look across alternative industries, and I'll share with you how one does that. Obviously, you look at different kinds of strategic groups, and you redefine who the industry buying group is. I'll show you just now what Amazon has done and how fundamentally they've changed their business by moving into what is known as complementary products and services. Microsoft's done, I beg your pardon, Apple's done exactly the same thing. This involves a huge focus on what's called functional emotional orientation. I don't have time to talk about it now, but we will certainly cover that on the EDP program. Now, the Blue Ocean Shift really is a 6-step process, which I'll be taking you through, explaining how you can fundamentally move your company into a space that's uncontested. Now, let's look at what else Zoom did, because they use digital platforms and concentricity and digitization in a big way. What does this mean? Well, digitization, if you've ever heard any of my presentations previously, is about converting something that's analog into something that's digital. So if I took a picture of your face is analog, right? You can feel your face, it's continuous, it's not digital, it's an analog thing. It's like handwriting is analog. It converts into something digital. Electronic photograph of a cell phone photograph is a digital representation of an analog object. We call that a digital twin. So digitization is the process of creating a digital twin. Digitalization is when you build a process out of this. So for example, if I can feature myself on my phone, that entire feature process is now digitalization. Right? So you're building processes out where you embed these digitized assets like a digital photograph. Digital transformation is when you implement this across an entire company, or you implement it across an entire society, or even government. So you could, for example, if you could passport control in many countries, I fly into Dubai, if you register your fingerprint, you can just walk through the gate, take a picture and put your finger down, and you can just walk through. So in other words, you don't need to go through passport control. Now, that's digital transformation in action. So COVID clearly had a big impact. We can see that many companies thought digital transformation would be driven by the CEO or the CTO. It was actually driven by COVID. Now, why was it driven by COVID? Well, because there was a huge change in the behavior of consumers. You got traumatized societies. You had a massive change in trust. You've had a fundamental shift in the way they change. But importantly, you've had this huge speeding up of digital transformation and robot adoption. So we've got a lot more people who are very willing to use technology themselves and to do more self-service. So effectively, the digital economy accelerated. Now, what is the digital economy? And we'll be talking about this in the program as well. The digital economy really is an economy that is largely multi-sided. What does that mean? It means that you build a marketplace with a buy side and a sell side. So if you look at Facebook, there are people who publish stories, there are people who consume stories. You look at YouTube, there are people who create videos and people who consume videos. If you look at Pinterest, there are people who load pictures and people who consume pictures. So there are producers and there are consumers. So we call this a prosumer model, production and consumption occurring on the same platform. That's a multi-sided marketplace. Multi-sided marketplaces are powerful because Amazon is exactly the same. It's a multi-sided marketplace. You've got buyers and you've got sellers. Now, the beauty about multi-sided marketplaces is that it's a winner-take-all market. I mean, YouTube's number one. How many people use Vimeo, really? Very few. And Vimeo, you could argue, was number two. TikTok, perhaps, but TikTok's just a short, 30-second video. So multi-sided marketplaces generally result in winner-take-all. Facebook's number one, there's no number two. Amazon's number one, there's no number two, right? Twitter's number one, there's no number two. You can see that they kicked Trump off Twitter. He has nowhere to go, right? I mean, it's been amazing. I haven't seen Twitter, I haven't seen Trump for like 2 weeks. It's weird. He hasn't appeared, materialized because everyone's rejected him. And so that shows you how dominant it is when Google, Facebook, and Twitter decide, and Instagram, and Pinterest, and you realize 3 or 4 companies own everything. And if these 3 companies decide you're not on their platform, well, you're not on their platform. So it shows you that you end up building a kind of an oligopoly. And it's a function of the way in which multi-sided marketplaces work. And the reason that this happens is because of something known as the network effect. I haven't got time to explain that here, but we will expand on that in the EDP and explain why this network effect is so powerful. The key point here is they generate huge amounts of data. And this data allows you to fundamentally shift and improve your product over time. Now, what's very clear is that if you ask what's really going to be important in establishing a company as a digital native company, number one is customer centricity. It's very clear that if you're not building a customer centric culture, you're really going to struggle. Now, why is everyone focusing on customer centricity? Well, here's an example, right? While banks all over the world are designed to give you products, Amazon went out and copied every product that every bank has. This is just one example, right, of Chase for Business. Everything that Chase for Business does, Amazon does. The difference is Amazon doesn't run this by looking at profitability per product. Amazon doesn't care if they lose money on one of these products. Amazon wants to make money on you. They want to make money on the customer. So Amazon's become very customer centric. They're looking at how can I maximize what I can make from the customer, whereas the typical bank's saying, how can I make more money out of my credit card? How can I make my checking account better? How can I make more money out of my car loan, home loan, or my prepaid card? You can see the fundamental difference. Banks are product centric. Amazon is customer centric. Amazon's trying to make more money per customer. not per product. You see a very big move from product centricity to customer centricity, where product centricity is about market share and customer centricity is about share of customers' wallet. So instead of looking at market and profit share, you're looking at best customer share. I want the best customer and I want the best share of their wallet. Now, how do you do that? And that's what digital transformation is about. So what are the most important implications of this shift from product to customer? It's about, how do you deal with loss-making products? You have to get rid of product-centric teams. You got to change your design capabilities. You got to think about how to keep customers who are particularly valuable to you, and you have to understand customer expectations. So the key point here is that you stop measuring things like market share and product margin, and you start measuring things like wallet share, and you start looking at things like lifetime value of customer, churn rates, and NPS or net promoter score. These become the new definition of success. So instead of looking at product margin, which is a product-centric way of looking at the world, if your company is run by looking at product margin, you're at huge risk of being cannibalized by somebody else who looks at lifetime value of customer. Why? Because they will offer your product for free. And if they offer your product for free, because overall they're making money on the product, your business will go bust. And then they'll increase the price afterwards. A very good example of this is what Apple did with the Apple iPod. Steve Jobs came in and said, Apple iPod's making 20% of our revenue. I'm going to kill the Apple iPod. And the way I'm going to kill it is I'm going to make the iPod an app. Eventually, they even called it an iPod app on an iPhone. Then they made it into iTunes, and eventually it's now Apple Music. Now, Apple Music, basically, what Apple said was, I'd rather have the customer than have the product. So they dissolved the product, killed the product, and they protected the customer. So you can see this shift in thinking is quite powerful, right? Because the percentage of repeat buyers in the Apple ecosystem is incredibly high. It's about 90%, one of the highest repeat buying rates of any product in the world. And that includes Mercedes-Benz and BMW. So in other words, Apple's got this huge loyalty. And they've got this loyalty because of the way in which they manage their customer centricity platform. You can see the numbers here. What Apple then did is saying, look, we're going to stop looking at product profitability. We're going to look at share of wallet. And this is what happened just to service revenue by selling things like services. You can see that service revenue in Q4 2019 was already at 20%. It's even higher now. So it's closer to 25%. So Apple Movies, I've got Apple Storage, I've got Apple Music, I've got Apple Books, Apple Magazines. You've even got Stadia, which is, I think, Apple's gaming platform, or Arcade. I can never remember which one is which. I think it's either Arcade or Stadia is the Apple gaming platform. So in other words, what Apple has done is say, forget about a product-centric view. Let's figure out a way to get consumers to spend as much of their wallet with us rather than with somebody else. So we're going to talk about how one builds businesses like this on the EDP as well. Here's another example. This is Apple. This is Amazon. If you look at what Amazon done, Amazon started out selling books. Then they built an e-commerce marketplace. And today, you've got industry collision in action. Because basically, once Amazon had built a large enough community, Amazon could sell anything. Amazon could sell audiobooks. They could sell a smart speaker, music system, movie reviews, gaming streaming, video streaming, e-commerce. They're competing with everyone. And it would not surprise me in the least if Amazon launched a travel agency, Amazon launched a food delivery service. I see Amazon launching all of these things. Why? Because once you trust Amazon, and once Amazon can see that you understand that these people, you understand that you didn't go to the shop today because I didn't see you shop for food, so maybe I should hit you with a voucher for a pizza and I'll deliver a pizza for you. Well, who else could do that? Amazon can do it because Amazon's got this perspective on your 360 life. Now, please keep loading questions, folks. I'm going to go to the questions in about 5 minutes' time. So this is another example of what Amazon has done. So what are some of the challenges here? The big challenges here are the following, right? So you got functional silos in big companies, which prevents you from sharing data. The credit card guys don't share with the home loan guys. You've got the culture is not aligned around customer needs. Everyone's looking internally at tweaking, adding more features to the ATM. I mean, people aren't even using ATMs anymore. Sometimes there's missing technology platforms to manage all this data. And sometimes we don't even know what customer centricity means. So I'm going to give you an example now of how these companies are merging customer centricity with digital platforms and with a lean and agile system. And by the way, it's not only in B2C, but it's also in B2B and B2B2C. So B2B2C is where, take for example, Procter & Gamble sells to ShopRite, who sells to you and I. So that's a B2B2C model, right? Where a person sells through an intermediary in order to get to the consumer. And the problem that Procter & Gamble's got is Procter & Gamble does not know who buys Omo, but sorry, Omo is Unilever. So Unilever has no idea that who bought Omo, right? But ShopRite does. If you've got the ShopRite card, when you shop and they swipe your card, Spar's got the Spar card, Pick n Pay's got the Pick n Pay card, they know what you've bought, but Unilever doesn't know. Think about how powerful that is. The strength of the retail is much higher because they can understand the needs of the individual consumers, because they've got your profile when you registered for that card, and they can now tie you back to the things that you bought. So customer centricity, and we'll be talking more about this in the program, is how do we design the customer journey through our business? How do we manage the experience, and how do we manage customer value? What do customers actually value? And so part of this is about obviously design thinking. We've got to figure out new ways of understanding customers, and I'll be sharing with you some wonderful case studies of companies who are in this crisis, really innovated their way out of it by listening, experiencing, asking, and testing new ways of building businesses. One of the key things is they got in touch with the pulse of the digital customer during all of this. You see, the pulse of the digital customer has changed. When the internet was first built, it was about information. Then along came social media, and social media was about transparency. But when digital came along, it was about self-control. And when COVID came, it made self-control incredibly important. So today is relationships, right, that we need to be building are actually quite different. We need convenience, we need on-demand, we need personal, and we need to be an awesome company because people need to love you. Right? I mean, I rave about the companies that I do business with because they're just so good. And once I find a company that I like, I buy everything that they make because everything that they make is just fantastic. So what does that mean in terms of how we should be running our businesses? Well, we need more personalization. We've got to think about our people and the culture. We've got to think about simplicity, and we've got to think about the story and the attitude that we build into our businesses. So some of this is about a digital skill, which is the hard stuff, and some of it's about the human skill, which is the soft stuff. So if you think about this and what companies have done, you can see that the best companies in the world are all focusing on these 4 blocks. And we will expand more on this in the program to look at how you can really re-engineer your company for the customer relationships of tomorrow. One of the things we're going to be looking at is, the customer journey. All of these companies looked at customer journey. Look at Zoom. They fundamentally changed the way in which you travel through the Zoom experience. And so you have the customer journey in terms of what they want to do. You've got multiple touch points, and then you've got the experience level. What people don't realize is that if you have one bad experience, it contaminates the entire customer rating for your company. And so what you really want to do is analyze the journey, design the touch points, and manage the experience so that you can up this entire line across the entire channel. The other thing you need to do is to figure out what are customers prepared to pay for. And this is really important because today, as we go forward, you'll start to see, for example, people aren't prepared to pay for online webinars. Now, go back 5 years, maybe people would pay for that. People are actually zoomed out, they're webinared out, they're looking for simplicity. And so you need to get into the mind of the customer, the digital customer, the customer under COVID, and what this means. So a good example of this is the 4 things that companies need to be doing. And this is just an illustration, but in every sector, there are certain things you need to be focusing on. So the 4 things you really need to be doing are, you need to digitize your channel, you need to digitize your products and services, you need to digitize your staff, and you need to digitize your operation. And depending on what sector you're in and what functions you have to focus your money differently. In some cases, you need to be spending money on assets. In other cases, you need to be spending money on proposition. In other cases, you need to be spending money on channels. And so what we will be talking about is, depending on your industry, where should I be placing my investment bets? And how digitally advanced is our sector? Because some sectors are very advanced, like take the banking sector, the telecom sector, and the media sector. They're very advanced. Also the travel sector, very advanced. So they should be putting their money somewhere else. But if you're in the mining sector, the retail sector, for example, or the transportation and warehousing sector, maybe you'd have a different emphasis. Finally, there's a big focus on things like cost ovation and servitization. I actually want to talk about them just in passing. Cost ovation was a concept that Stephen Winker came up with. Stephen and I were together on a webinar at the JBS about 6 months ago. And he basically focused and built an entire theory around innovation that gives customers exactly what they want and nothing more. And so part of what we'll be talking about on the program are these rules. I haven't got time to get through it now. And the methodology that we use for helping you come up with ideas, that how to make it, how to move it, how to sell it in a very cost-effective way. And the servitization says stop selling products and start selling outcomes. So what is it that we can do to stop selling products? How can we move from selling you, a cell phone, selling you a cell phone contract with a data limit, or saying, look, I'm going to sell you, unlimited calling, for example. And that's, you're selling a solution rather than a product. And we'll be talking about how one designs, because nobody wants a drill. Everybody really wants the hole. Why don't you sell the hole? Right? So why are we selling the drill? Nobody wants to own the drill. I just need a way to get the hole. I don't really want to own the drill. I want the outcome rather than the input. And we'll figure out, I'll show you in healthcare, mining, in retail, etc., how you can build solutions that do exactly that. So some key lessons, folks, before we go to the questions. There's a great program called the EDP. It's 27 hours. You can register, bring your teams. We'll be going through this entire circle in detail. We'll have a number of guest speakers coming in from e-commerce, the fourth industrial revolution, how to innovate in corporates, design thinking, and many more. And so these guest speakers will enrich what we are going to say. There's a lot more detail available that you can access. There's some podcasts that you're welcome to access, called Divolution, brought to you by Solid Gold. There's a website here that you can get another podcast on. And you can also go to my website, where there's over 100 to 200 thought leadership pieces, and you're more than welcome to access that as well. So folks, thank you very much. I hope that you found that useful. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen. So thank you very much. And Louis, I guess good time to maybe take some questions. Let's see. Philip got a comment: focus on competitor weak points, shortcomings, and prioritize end user needs in order to establish a bridgehead. They are now using that strategic base for expansion. Thanks, Philip. I think that's a very good, that's a great comment. And I presume you meant this comment for Zoom, because I think that's exactly what Zoom did. And so I think lovely comment. I like the way you summarize that, very succinct. There's an anonymous attendee who said, just going back to the case study, Zoom has done well to meet the market needs during COVID, but how do they protect themselves from adverse market shifts in a post-COVID world, for example, education sector reverting back to face-to-face classes? and that I think is a great point. But I think the key point here is it's not so much about what they do, it's about how they figure out what the answer is, right? So the key point here is, what exactly are they? How are they coming up with new ideas? What systems are they using? What models are they using? What methods are they using? And how are they actually coming up with an understanding of what customer needs are, how customers' value systems are changing, and where they think customers are going to go to next. So I think your comment is right. And, I mean, I don't want to give Zoom, free consulting advice. There's a number of things that I would do. Personally, I think they're on the right track. By moving towards a multi-channel, omni-platform, omni-device communication and collaboration and productivity platform, yes, they're taking on Microsoft head on, but very clever in terms of what they're doing. And I think there's a huge opportunity there. Now, Ahmed's question again was, please elaborate on the elements needed for a successful pivot. Ahmed, I think I've taken you through some of the points that I would use and we'll be covering on the program. I've had a request to reshare the link, which we've done. And so folks, anyone who wants to join up, folks, and sign up, you will get a free copy of the Divolution book. So please don't go out and buy the book if you're signing up for the program. Right. Thank you, folks. So I think that's really what I wanted to share with you. If there's any other questions, please drop them into chat or drop them into the Q&A. Just checking quickly. Here we go, Louis. So thank you. That was wonderful. I hope you got some value out of that, and I'm hoping to see some of you on the program in the future. Louis.
Thank you so much, Herman. That was a fantastic session. I really enjoyed it. Now, I suppose I wasn't supposed to enjoy it as much as what I did. So thanks very much, Herman. Got a lot out of it. So guys, thank you very much, all attendees. We've had a huge amount of interest in the webinar today. So thanks very much for that, for your attendance. We'll be publishing the webinar information session as a video on the University of Johannesburg YouTube channel, and we'll let you know via email when that is available. And I would just like to remind everyone that everyone who signs up to the Virtual Executive Development Program, or EDP, presented by Professor Herman Singh, will receive a free copy of Herman's new book, Devolution. Well worth the read. I can attest to that personally. It's a fantastic book. In the chat box is the link to the course, all the details you need, where you can sign up. And when we send you your next email with the recorded webinar, we'll naturally also include the link to the EDP there. Thank you, Peter. Peter says, thank you, Herman. That was amazing. I fully agree. Thanks very much for your attendance. Pendile says, thank you, Herman. Really insightful session. So watch out. You'll receive the link in your inbox if you want to read more. Daphne asks if the EDP will benefit if she's in the cryptocurrency business. I think without a doubt. Without a doubt. Cryptocurrency by definition is already digital. So there's no doubt that you'll be able to benefit from the EDP, Daphne. Okay, guys, that's it for now. Thanks very much for your attendance. And that's goodbye from the Johannesburg Business School.